Johann Jacob Diesbach was a Swiss painter, pigmenter and dyer during the early 1700s, and one morning he was occupied with the task to recreate the color ruby red with a different recipe. The color was originally made by squashing millions of female coccinelles, which are small parasitic insects that grow on the nopal cactus in Central and South America. The thing about these parasites is that they are really picky about climate. Strong winds or frost could damage their bodies, and all the while being tasty snacks for birds, rats and caterpillars. The Spanish conquistadors would loot the South American people, and in these lootings one of the greatest treasures to them was the blood of these parasites. The red scarlet blood of these creatures was associated with dynasty, with power. So if you were a regular person in Spain at that time who could afford to buy, let's say, a pair of these red ribbons, you could probably buy 1,000 of these. So Diesbach and his apprentice, Johann Conrad Dippel, about whom we'll talk about pretty soon, were frustrated with the Spanish lootings. So they decided to concoct ruby red with a different method that wouldn't require such parasites and the painstaking procedures. So they poured potash over a distillation of animal parts, they stirred, and they waited. Well, turns out, the potash was a little contaminated. The concoction wasn't the powerful ruby red they so desired, but they had produced a blue of such beauty that Diesbach thought he had discovered the color used by Egyptians to adorn the skin of their gods, which had been lost forever. The color was Prussian blue. In no time, Prussian blue became a sensation in European art, thanks to its lower prices and accessibility. The first great painter to make use of it was the Dutchman Peter van der Werf in 1709, in his portrayal of Entombment of Christ. And soon, other great works followed, such as the skies in Van Gogh's Starry Night and the waves of the Great Wave of Kanagawa, a symbol of Japanese culture which is still relevant in fashion advertisement today. Think of it this way, Prussian blue became to painters what cigarettes are for French people, what feet are for Tarantino. They just couldn't get enough. Oh yes, a little about the apprentice, Conrad Dippel. Dippel on the surface presented himself as a regular guy, a philosopher, artist, doctor, but by his peers he was considered as the usual cute names. He was called the fucking devil himself. Remember the distillation of animal parts? Yep, that was his department. The guy was infamous for his extreme cruelty towards live or dead animals, which he dissected in extremely gruesome ways. He spent 7 years in prison for his radical ideas and practices. According to him, the only goal of his life was to transplant a soul from one body to another, which wasn't quite successful obviously. And then he went around and claimed to have discovered some sort of potion which was made from some really funky shit that could heal any sort of ache or illness. He failed miserably again. Ironically, the only effective use of Dippel's potion was as an insecticide because of its horrible smell, and also in the future by the German army as a non-lethal chemical weapon, which they dropped into the wells of North Africa to slow General Patton and his men. A few decades go by, and then comes another brilliant guy, Carl Wilhelm Scheele. On his table is a pot filled with Prussian blue, and in his hand is a spoon coated with traces of sulfuric acid, with which he stirred and created one of the most potent poison the world had ever seen at that time. He named it prussic acid, more commonly known as cyanide. Scheele suffered from what we could call a chronic case of bad luck. His work was mostly overshadowed by his underqualified scientific colleagues. His publisher delayed publishing his work for more than 5 years, and the guy used to go as far as to often smell and taste the new substances he concocted in his own lab. So he drank a jug of cyanide and died instantly. What? That totally didn't happen. I made that up. Instead, he slowly exposed himself to arsenic and other toxic chemicals in his lab, which slowly ravaged his liver. His body covered head to toe in pleural blisters and paralyzed by the buildup of fluid in his joint. To make things worse, these were the same symptoms suffered by thousands of European children whose toys were painted with the same arsenic pigment Scheele had created in his lab, an amazing emerald green. A color of such beauty and terror that it achieved in a few years what the Great Britain could not in decades. It killed Napoleon. Napoleon painted his chambers and bathrooms in the house in which he was imprisoned with the same dazzling green. The toxin from the paint dropped his eyes into their sockets, turned the man pale and made him so skinny that the doctors could check his pulse by just looking at it. He died at the age of 51 on the 5th of May 1821. So if arsenic takes its time with its victims by slowly accumulating inside bodily tissues for years, slowly sucking the life out of its prey, cyanide takes your breath away by stimulating the carotid receptors simultaneously, which initiates a reflex that cuts off respiration. The speed with which it acts makes it the most preferable for countless assassins and suicide victims. The effects are so swift that there is only one historical account of its taste by a man named MP Prasad, a goldsmith from Kerala, India. Prasad checked into a hotel room for the purpose of killing himself. He swallowed about 10 milligrams of cyanide and in his last few moments managed to scribble these lines. Doctors, potassium cyanide. I have tasted it. It burns the tongue and tastes acrid. During the early 20th century, cyanide was used by the Germans in the form of Zyklon B, which consisted of hydrogen cyanide, eye irritants, and other absorbent materials. The Germans would use this compound to massacre Jews in Auschwitz, Majdanek, and Mauthausen. They would drop the cloud of gas through the hatches in the roofs, and a slight aroma of raw almonds would fill the gas chambers. And on the topic of chemical weapons, how could we not talk about the father of chemical warfare? The German Fritz Haber. Fritz was a man of genius. In fact, the only one who possessed the capability of understanding the complex molecular reactions that would go on to kill thousands within minutes. He came from a family of dyers. He started off as an assistant chemist at the Friedrichiana Technical University in Germany. From there, he went on to become the head of chemistry section of the Ministry of War and having dinner with Kaiser Wilhelm II himself. Fritz's wife was Clara Immerwahr, who was the first woman to receive a doctorate in chemistry at the German university. She was not only familiar with the ways of organic chemistry and the ways of war, she had seen the effects herself on animals in laboratory and that day on the test field. Fritz with his wife and a couple of his students was up on a mountain, overlooking the plains where the gas canisters were placed. Clara was petrified and aware of the capacity of this evil, while Fritz looked through in the distance, going over the calculations over and over again. The test subjects were on the plains below, and the test was about to commence. Before starting, Fritz saw at the edge a beautiful white flower. It was bent forward and it danced with the wind. He watched it for a while. The canisters were opened and the horrid green cloud seeped toward the test subjects below. The horses neighed anxiously and they jerked their heads around. Something didn't feel right. Fritz looked for the flower below. It was moving, but now slowly, and then it stopped, and suddenly it started to move backwards. A strong gust of wind has changed the direction of the gas straight towards the hill where Haber and his troops were. They didn't know what was happening, or maybe they just couldn't respond to it. They rode as fast as they could. They tried not to breathe anything in. They didn't have the hearts to turn behind and look at the giant cloud just right behind them. They coughed like dogs. Their visions got blurry and a smell of pineapple and bleach filled their throats. And that's when Fritz's horse collapsed. He tried to get up, but he couldn't. He looked up in the distance and in the blur of it all, he saw a black spot approaching. And when he turned his head toward his side, he saw the darkened blue lifeless faces of dead and dying men, all standing over him, together watching him convulse in the sand. All muscles cramping simultaneously, choking on his yellow mucus, they watched him crawl. The spot grew bigger, and he could hear the sound of hooves. He was rescued by his wife. When they got home, Clara accused him of perverting the ideals of science. She told him how he had used science to kill life on an industrial scale, how he was nothing short of the devil himself. Fritz ignored her, and then he told her that during peacetime a scientist belongs to the world, but during wartime he belongs to his country. On April 22, 1915, marks the day as the first use of chemical weapon near the small town of Ypres in Belgium against the French troops. They saw an enormous greenish cloud, twice as high as a man and denser than the winter fog. The leaves died on the trees as it passed through. Birds fell from the sky. The French troops were so confused as they had never seen anything like it. And on the other side of it was Fritz, in full uniform, smoking a cigar, priding himself on his calculations, as he had concluded that launching or dropping the canisters on the Allied troops would not be as effective as just waiting for the prevailing winds. One of the soldiers who had opened the 6,000 canisters of gas that day wrote in a letter, "We suddenly heard the French yelling. In less than a minute, they started with the most rifle and machine gun fire that I had ever heard. Every artillery gun, every machine gun, every rifle that the French possessed must have been firing. I had never heard such a noise. The hail of bullets going over our heads was unbelievable, but it was not stopping the gas. The wind kept moving the gas toward the French line. We heard the cows bawling and the horses screaming. The French kept on shooting." When Fritz returned home that day, he decided to celebrate. He invited his friends, family, and relatives and colleagues to a grand party. They drank. He told them stories from the war. They laughed. They cheered Fritz for his intelligence and his bravery. And amongst this chaos, Clara walked down to the garden, took off her shoes and shot herself in the chest with her husband's service revolver. After the end of the First World War, Fritz was declared a war criminal by the Allies. He fled Germany and took residence in Switzerland. After that, he sought asylum in England, hoping to reach Palestine. He was never accepted anywhere. Everywhere he went, his colleagues scorned him, aware of his instrumental role in the chemical war. However, when he was in Switzerland, he received a letter informing him that he had won the Nobel Prize for chemistry for discovering something decades ago. In 1907, Fritz became the first person to obtain nitrogen, the main nutrient required for plant growth, directly from the air. If it wasn't for Haber, millions who were dependent on natural fertilizers such as guano for food would have died due to lack of nourishment. In prior centuries, the Britishers had gone as far as to dig up tombs of ancient pharaohs and their slaves to extract the nitrogen in their bones. And in the US, more than 30 million bison carcasses were picked up one by poor Native Americans and by poor farmers and sold to the Northwestern Bone Syndicate. And then they would ground the remains to make fertilizers and the bone black color, the darkest pigment at that time. Fritz single-handedly put a stop to these practices. You wouldn't have to dig up millions of graves, now you could just pull nitrogen straight out of the air. He doubled the amount of disposable nitrogen, which not only cured world hunger but in a matter of a century took the human population from 1.6 billion to more than 8 billion. What do you make of a man as such? What color do you see when you look at him? Was he the devil his wife thought him to be or the savior of humanity? Obviously, you're not going to find a correct answer on a 20-something-year-old's pop science YouTube video. But what can be said for sure is that Fritz was a patriot. He had boundless love for his nation. In fact, so much love that it gave him a sense of invulnerable righteousness. And those who are the righteous ones bear the burden of protecting their values by insisting that all other values are shit, so we have to kill it. Fritz was Jewish. He passed away in 1934, and after his death, the Nazis would use in their gas chambers the same pesticides he had helped them create, which went on to kill his half-sisters, his brother-in-laws, nephews, and countless other Jews. Even today, the brick walls of Auschwitz are stained with a terrifying yet beautiful blue. If you try to listen to it, you can hear it. You can hear it singing about its violent origins, about revenge, about power, about the dead and the dying, the lost and the forgotten.